Hello, very beautiful community. Hello, very beautiful community. See and hear test. Let me know if you can see and hear me. Last time on the live, we did a live with slightly off sound. So let's rock and roll. And what I've done, and I'm going to do this in a very original way today, I am just extracting the comments and questions at the top that were left by people waiting, and I'm going to shove them onto another place with a copy and paste, and I'll answer them not all in one go, but as we go through, so that I'm present with you rather than just stuck above in the comment section. So the first 10 or so questions from before we started I've got out, so you're all going to have them answered. So happy birthday to anybody whose birthday it is close to today. It was my birthday yesterday, and I couldn't do a live yesterday for health reasons. But it's great to be with all of you now. Let me have a look what questions there are. So I'll take a few from the top, and then, but I'll keep being in the live chat with you, beautiful community. So feel free to throw anything at me. I am actually looking now. Yevhen, Vlad, I'd be so happy if you could, move your mic back to the room next door where I can't be for health reasons. What do you usually see in your dreams when you're asleep? So I got myalgic encephalomyelitis in 2003, and as a postgrad here in the UK at Oxford. And for a couple of years, I couldn't speak, couldn't really move, I could still stand, but I was sort of 98% bedbound, 95% bedbound. And for the first 20 years of that illness, I never was ill a single time in my dreams. And often what happened in my dreams was the opposite of illness. It was sort of flying or floating or swimming. I got microvascular damage from COVID a year and a half ago. And since then, I have been mostly sick in my dreams. So my psyche found the COVID, the complete loss of an ability to stand. Standing is very violent and life-threatening for me if I were to even half try it. The month in hospital where I was not far off from dying, I found that impactful psychically in a way that shifted my dream pattern. And what happened then was that I was always ill I'm always ill now in my dreams for the last year and a half, but I'm always less ill than I am in real life. So in my dreams, I'm usually walking, and then something happens to me. That means that I can't carry on walking. So I'm sort of less ill in my dreams, but ill for the last year and a half. And before a year and a half ago, for 20 years of being ill with ME, I never was ill a single time in my dreams. Now, quick question, how fascist is Farage? Look at the score I give to Trump in my main channel video about monarchism, fascism, and hyper-neoliberalism, and take 1 point off. $3991, happy birthday. Ray of birthday sunshine to you. Aside from our current political turmoil, do you have any advice for psychologically dealing with modernity in general? Yes. If you have a knack for it, have a relationship with transcendent things. And transcendent things can be things that, in your experience, deliver you messages from another world. That could be nature, that could be art. You don't have to be religious for this. Number one. Number two, you really have to develop an authentic sense of direction, because the social network is not going to generate you enough meaning. I don't mean the network of your friends. I mean just the social web of being in a modern society, um, and the web of meanings and purposes that bestows upon you. That's not going to be enough unless you also um, very freely, but also self-consciously, develop an authentic sense of direction for your life. What's me? What's less me? What job should I really be doing? Um, you know, who do I love? How can I be close to things I love, and so on. Dana the Hill. Let's take one more from the top, and then we'll come back to the live comments section. How are you celebrating today? So, 2 days before my birthday, I managed to sit on the lounger for 1.5 to 2 hours, to lie down on the lounger, really in a position a bit more reclined than this. Fairly successfully, with a couple of breaks. And I put some wine in my mouth, but on balance, it turned out I didn't swallow any. Then the next day, this was the day before my birthday, I sat up for about half an hour, 45 minutes in the same lounger, and I began to feel really profoundly ill. It was like my body was beginning to curdle and things were beginning to spin. I was being moved to another dimension. And then for the next 24 hours, I entered a kind of microvascular hell. I just couldn't breathe with oxygen. And I entered a kind of ME hell with a brainstem crisis, which meant I struggled to swallow as well. My body was sort of on fire. So it was the worst day probably in 6 months. Um, and that mostly fell yesterday on my birthday. But then, really surprisingly, by about 7 in the evening, I managed to stabilize, and then managed to spend half an hour in the wheelchair. And that stabilization has sustained into today. So that's my answer. So it was really, really difficult, quite a violent birthday where I felt physically unsafe. What's your favorite contemporary well-known politician? I think it is like pulling something through a needle to get the right kind of politician we need today. So the answer in the English-speaking world, in the English-speaking Western world, is nobody. Some people are closer than others, but if you had to push me, I would end up trying to say, let's put these 4 people into one person. And that would be my fictional answer. But it would need to be fictionalized. There have been politicians I have admired in my country, in the UK, over recent decades. I can name one, Shirley Williams, the Labour politician who then went to form a smaller party in the 80s that then merged with the Liberal Democrats. Shirley is dead. She died in 2021. She was born in 1930, and she was the daughter of Vera Brittain, who wrote wonderfully about the sort of, milieu of women in the First World War. And Shirley's first husband, with whom she had one child, was my philosophical hero, Bernard Williams, even though they were not compatible as partners. Shirley had a wonderful sense of political realism with a deep ethical core, and the sense of integrity, and then enough intellectual capacity to understand what was compelling about competing political claims, and what was compelling about different political and cultural and religious experience. And she also had a deep sense of structural disadvantage, as well as a sense of sort of the ebbs and flows of Western civilization. If you pushed me really hard to just give you a list of leaders today, globally, whether that be in South America, in Africa, in the West, I would struggle. Probably women would disproportionately appear on that list. All right. Poo poo is asking, why do I think Farage is a fascist? I think that Farage is more not a fascist than a fascist. You are all fascists a little bit. That's how ideology works. Ideology is wherewithal politically, how you orient yourself toward the political landscape around you. So you're all a bit conservative, a bit socialist, microscopically fascist too. You're just all very low on fascism. The key distinction with Farage is, do you think that he is an institutional politician, or do you think he's out to break institutions? What I'm saying is that um, basically, Farage finds it more important to advance his own political interests than to preserve counter-majoritarian checks and balances. So I put him more in the Trump camp than in the sort of Mitt Romney camp when it comes to folks on the right or on the ex-right. If there was a UK general election tomorrow, who would you vote for, and who would you definitely not vote for? I would definitely not vote for Reform. I would vote for the Tories over Reform, but I would definitely not vote for the Tories. And then it'd be a local decision. And that would be based on two considerations. Who do I want to win, right? And who do I want to give sort of a bigger tally of the national vote to, right? So I'd really be choosing between Labour, the Lib Dems, and the Greens, depending on, if you like, where I was in the country. And I would not be impressed with any of these three choices, but I would make one choice out of these three. And there are compelling arguments to go in each of these three directions for me. I am in a fairly safe Labour seat in East London, and so if I voted Labour, I'd be voting just to give a vote to somebody who's going to win anyway. So that would give me more reason to vote for another party. Can you comment on Isaiah Berlin's relationship with Anna Akhmatova versus Isaiah Berlin's relationship with Hannah Arendt? Well, Isaiah never had a relationship with Hannah Arendt of any kind. I tend to mention Hannah Arendt positively when I mention her. Do I think that Hannah Arendt is a great and profound and world historically important thinker? No, she's not. She's not one of the leading thinkers of the 20th century, in my view. But she has a lot to say to people in our circumstances. And if I were to mention Hannah Arendt 10 times, I think 9 would be positive. One of the problems Berlin had with her is her feeling that you hold people politically responsible even under extreme circumstances. So, for instance, she would want to hold Jews who lost their mind and didn't know how to balance preservation and collaboration under the Nazi regime. She would hold them really responsible, whereas Isaiah would tend to say you judge people much less under extreme circumstances. I also think that when you dive out of politics, Arendt's convictions about the big questions in philosophy are ones that are to a degree alien to me. Funnily enough, a lot of them come from a Nazi who was Heidegger, um, a brilliantly imaginative philosopher, who was also a very flawed philosopher, not just a flawed man, but a very flawed philosopher. And of course, Arendt and Heidegger had an affair. And I also reject, while mostly accepting, an important element of Arendt's view about the banality of evil. In other words, I don't think that Mr. Patrushev or Mr. Not to compare the two regimes, or Mr. Goering are banal. I think they are imaginative instigators. So I think that the banality of evil applies to most humans who are engaged in evil, but it does not apply to the humans who are concocting it, instigating and leading it. They're not banal, they're highly imaginative. And in fact, very little of the worst evil happens without people like that. So the instigators of evil are not banal. I think Isaiah speaks for himself on his relationship with Akhmatova. One of the questions you can ask, I suppose, is about how far Isaiah felt really Russian. Isaiah was 12 when he left Latvia and Petersburg for London in the early 1920s. Isaiah is, in my view, more psychologically Russian than me. Partly it's because he left at 12, I left at 9. So that's one important question. And then another important question is just Isaiah, how much Isaiah related to Akhmatova through the 19th century as being, perhaps together with Pasternak, a kind of remnant of an absolutely exhilarating anti-authoritarian political movement in 19th century Russia. 19th century Russian intellectual thought is profoundly anti-authoritarian, which is why it's absurd to say that because Russia is an imperial monstrosity now, it should reflect on the horrifically imperial 19th century literature it produced. Well, some of it is, but a lot of it isn't. Russia, together with France, is at the peak of the anti-authoritarian tradition of social thought in the 19th century. Bogdan, wishing you much strength. Any recommended books for a recovering depressed person who is looking to expand his social circle of influence? There are some leadership thought leaders who are very popular but are also not bad. Two people I like who are doing different things are Brene Brown and Esther Perel. But I don't think books are necessarily going to get you there. I'm obviously a big fan of therapy. What I would say is that I would advise you to hunt for one or two people who you can introduce into your life with whom you can form a very close and magical friendship. Try to find depth in just one or two really close social relationships to which you give a lot, from which you receive a lot. I think that's important. And then don't be impatient. Think across the length of what is statistically likely to be the remainder of your life, where you want to get, and be patient. It's okay with some personal goals to be 15, 10, 5 years away from them. Mike, Brock, thank you so much for your lovely birthday wishes, and I'm going to get back to your message as well soon. Negve, Vlad, what are your intellectual weaknesses in your opinion? Well, there are two questions there, right? What are my intellectual weaknesses outside of what philosophy intellectually requires, which is most things, right? 98% of things I'm weak at, for reasons of both a lack of talent and a lack of motivation, right? That would span the entirety of the natural sciences. It would span all technical pursuits. It spans mathematics. That's a combination of lack of ability and lack of interest. Then the question is within philosophy, what are your weaknesses? And obviously, my biggest weakness is that I can't do philosophy much because I'm ill. But apart from that, if I had not been ill, I would have a book out or two of philosophy by now, by 45. What would be the strengths and weaknesses of these books? I'd also hopefully have a book out, but that may happen in even if I stay ill for the general public. So watch this space. But that would be about how to deal with democratic decline. But in philosophy, I would say that I'm less talented at those bits and less interested in those bits of philosophy that border the sciences, border the natural sciences. And when it comes to moral and political philosophy and moral psychology, the things I am interested in, I am a low-level genius at the level of talent, not output, because where's the output, right? When it comes to imagination and imaginative extraction and intuition. So I have very high, what I would call intellectual emotional intelligence. There's emotional intelligence to do with reading people, but there's also emotional intelligence to do with reading art and music, and as in reading works presented before you, and then also reading the world intellectually. You can have a high emotional intelligence at that. So these are my strengths. Then my relative weakness is technicality, systematization, analytical transparency, analytical clarity, right? I am a weaker analytical thinker than I am imaginative thinker. But am I analytically stronger than most professional philosophers? Yes. So it's a relative weakness. Well, let's take a couple of more questions from the top for funky fun. Cecilia, Vlad, have you ever had an epiphany? I haven't had an epiphany since a couple of bits of experience as a child. I gained a kind of elementary intellectual confidence when I was about 15 to 16. Before that age, I would not have allowed myself to ever contradict an adult academic, for instance. At the age of 16, I began to infrequently allow myself that. And by the age of 17, I knew I was sitting on something special to do with philosophical talent. And what I discovered was that you get much further if, rather than trying to do philosophy, you work on developing your talent for it, and you develop your talent for developing your talent. And that was an incredible revelation to me at the age of about 17 that has stayed with me. It's how I work myself on my own philosophical wherewithal, and it's also how I would how I work with clients in my consulting. The talent for developing your talent. If you've got physical health and then you've got that, you can accelerate past others equivalently positioned to you. Ross, how do you respond to the asymmetry argument of the antinatalist philosopher David Benatar? I don't know the argument well. I've vaguely come across it on YouTube. I would say that way of doing philosophy is not one I'm likely to share. If you want my real view on whether you should have children because of something like the climate crisis, the answer is that you've got to consider that there are going to be two modes of explanation there, if you like, that are never going to bridge. One is what's better for um, a human society looked at from above. Another is what's the right decision personally for you. It's very difficult to bridge the two. In other words, people who say, I am not having children because of the climate crisis, 4 times out of 5 are making a narcissistic, self-indulgent decision. 1 time out of 5, they're not. So it's completely possible to make a non-pathological decision to have 0 children because of the climate crisis, either because you don't want to boost the Earth's population too much, or because you don't want to bring children into a world where their future might be less good than yours. But and the truth is that their future will actually be worse than yours, but also better than yours in different ways. But what won't be the case is that their future will be cumulatively better than yours, which is what you would have said if you were, let's say, in 1950. So it's possible, but you need to be very psychologically healthy to make that decision. If you're a bit screwed up, you're going to make it in a sort of hyper identity politics way or in some kind of narcissistic way. So I don't trust most people who do that. But I do trust some people who do that. It just depends on how clean that decision is. So it's possible, but it puts a lot of pressure on you. Um, J.G. Leon. Um, happy birthday. Hope you're having a great and beautiful time. My question, how do you come out of a 10 years writer's block? Thanks. Depends on what the writer's block is. Either therapy or something that is non-therapeutic, that is a kind of strategic intervention. I do that in my consulting. So, but how possible it's going to be for you to shift in like 3 months depends on obviously the causes of the block. If the causes of the block are, I don't know, let's say levels of depression or anxiety that need to be treated biologically or therapeutically, that's a process of a few years. If the causes are different, you can get there in 3 months. But there's absolutely not a way that anybody could say something in the abstract, right? But you can do it. Ilse Weingart-Schofer, sorry for that butchering, of your tag. Vlad, I like your veracity. That's what I honor the most about you. I'd like to know where you get your knowledge of NPD from. One does have to be confronted with something like that. So I do think that, yes, you can't know NPD well just from reading the 20th century literature about it. I do think there's some good stuff. I mentioned Christopher Bollas's fairly recent writing about it positively in the main channel video on Trump's narcissism. So yes, you can get a long way, but you have to experience it, and personally. So you have to have proximity to somebody with a narcissistic personality disorder. A lot of people have such proximity, unfortunately, and a lot of people have multiple proximities of that kind. If you really don't, then talk to somebody whose life has been transformed by having a narcissistic person close to them in their life talk to the way they've been impacted, and I think that'll get right. Seems like you know about it, I know about it, but if you don't, get get somebody in who has been hugely impacted and they can capture it. And once you speak to 2 or 3 people like that, you can begin to see what patterns there are in common. How much is today's Vlad intellectually different from the Vlad of 10 or 20 years ago? So 20 years ago, Vlad was already sick, but was recently well. So he was full of hopes and aspirations in a 5-year plan and a 15-year plan for what to write and what to publish. The last time I changed my opinion on something of substance was actually around the time I got sick. I changed my mind on the relationship of Isaiah Berlin's liberalism with his value pluralism. I thought that there was conflict between the two up until I was a postgrad student. In fact, I think I was scheduled to give a talk at Oxford, which I didn't give, at the Occam Society in about 2003, end of 2003, early 2004 maybe, why Isaiah Berlin failed to ground liberalism, where I was going to say why his liberalism didn't follow from his pluralism. I was wrong about that, and it is about then that I changed my mind. Then I stopped being able to think for a year or two for health reasons, and then I came back to thinking. But that's the last time I had a different philosophical view. You might think it's a problem to not change, and I will not change my mind until I die on anything in philosophy. You might say, well, isn't that very close-minded? And the answer is usually it's the opposite. It's the most open-ended people who usually, I would say, the most open-minded people, people who are most disciplined about staying open-minded, even if they're engaged with something, who don't change their view because it's so slow for them to land on something. So it's funnily enough a sign of open-mindedness that you don't change any major view in philosophy for 50 years. It's not a sign of closed-mindedness, but that is relative to personality types. For some personality types, changing a mind is the more open-minded way to be. But for somebody with my profile, it would be a sign of a closed-mindedness, a sign of insufficiency of openness if I put myself in a position where I had to change my mind. That is different to political views, like how long will the Putin regime survive? Nearly all of the views I articulate on the channels are more superficial in the way I acquire them than my philosophical views. That doesn't mean that they're more likely to be wrong. I think most of the things I say are right because it's not difficult to get them right. But nearly everything I say about democracy, authoritarianism, is a lot easier to settle on than some of the bigger questions in ethics and politics. And on those, I won't change my mind about anything until I die. And that's a sign of open-mindedness. But it's a matter of personality, so don't generalize that to everybody. After all, the greatest philosopher of the 20th century, Wittgenstein, almost lived 2 philosophical lives that aren't compatible with one another. Marco Miranda, hey, Vlad, you have no idea how much you've helped my personal development, from understanding my own autism and ADHD to understanding the world around me. Thank you and happy birthday. Thank you. I want to improve in the way I talk about neurodiversity. I'm working on it. I face a really difficult structural problem because I often talk about the neurodiversity of politicians in a way that makes me be critical of them. I mean, for example, the neurodiversity of my current prime minister, who won't last long in his job, is actually connected with a deep sense of responsibility and integrity that he has. But right now, it's also connected with a propensity to certain political mistakes. And the problem is that it's when there are political mistakes or political failures that are mediated by neurodiversity, it's worth talking about them. And that creates this ill impression that, you know, you've got to talk about neurodiversity in politicians when it's a negative thing. Because there's just less pressure to talk about neurodiversity in politicians when it's a positive thing. The way I would argue, because there's no political crisis about it, right? It's not that we've got Trump, whose impulsivity is driving his narcissistic personality disorders. We've got to talk about it. With somebody like Angela Merkel, who you can be very critical of, but I would argue that her neurodiversity helped her be steady and it helped steady and advance her political virtues. It was a net positive. And that's wonderful to talk about, but it's less urgent because nothing has gone wrong. That it is a matter of public interest to legislate, and therefore it's almost easier to argue, well, this is more a private matter for Angela Merkel, if she's interested in reflecting on whether she's neurodiverse or not. So you see, this creates a real problem that I'm not happy about, because I end up talking about neurodiversity too much in the negative, because we've talked about it with folks like Liz Truss or Donald Trump. So I'm trying to work on that, and I'm gonna speak more positively about autism and ADHD without romanticizing them. I'm not somebody who goes in for every kind of fluffy thing the neurodiversity movement says. Officer Meow Meow Meow. What do you feel is the right way to overcome trauma? Is it A, accepting the damage that's happened, or B, growing so radically in response that we become grateful for the experiences? There is no conflict between the two. You have to accept the tragic element of life if you're going to process it. Imagine if I sat here and I said, I don't regret that I lost the ability to stand a year ago. I mean, you would think I'm a fool. Unless you're as hyper woke as some kind of extreme triple purpled hair teenager in Portland, you're going to think I've lost my mind completely. You're not going to trust anything I say, because that would be the most ridiculous thing in the world, because humans prefer to walk than not to be able to walk. So you have to accept the tragic element, but when you accept the tragic element, what you feel is life has given you something that you didn't ask for. So what you're processing is what it means to be in the world, and what it means that it is a constitutive feature of the world, that life gives you things you don't ask for. But it's still true you didn't ask for it. It's not a good way to process trauma to think that something bad happened and you retrospectively ask for it and want it. Unless it's a sort of fleeting experience, then you can say, I welcome it. Let's say you had a relationship that traumatized you, that didn't leave you permanently harmed. Well, except for the trauma, which you can process, then you could say, yeah, sure. Okay, that was a bad experience, but I don't regret it. But there are experiences that genuinely leave damage, and the worst thing for processing damage is to pretend there is no damage. That's what my philosophical hero Bernard Williams would call the loss of the sense of loss. And you don't want to experience the loss of the sense of loss. Alex, Vlad, can you tell us a little bit about why you love humans? And I'm trying to open this bottle of sparkling water. And specifically, why you love your niche in philosophy. So, I think that, there we go. I think that there are two ways to love humans, and I love them in a way that goes to the core of why a lot of you love me. Tendentiously, for most humans, it tends to go like this. Oh my word, human beings are constructive creatures. They're beautiful and wonderful. And the world is a great place. Or, oh my God, humans are destructive and are full of mixed motives, destructive and constructive motives. And there's a lot not to like about them. And so it's kind of like yuck. It's sort of like terrible to live in a society with these creatures. For me, loving humans and thinking that humans are ridiculous or ludicrous generates no conflict. I've just given you the example of the destructive and perhaps morally deleterious element of humans, but we can also pick the stupidity element of humans, right? And again, there are a lot of people who think that humans are deep down really clever and that they love humans. There's a lot of people who think that humans are unbelievably dumb for the most part and they hate them. I think humans are, for the most part, more dumb than smart, but I love them. And I wouldn't love them anymore if they were less dumb and more smart, right? Most people in important positions of power in the world today have no idea what they're doing. Once you look behind, it's a clown show. It's a clown show how, organizations, institutions, important things are run in the world. But I am saying we are ludicrous and I love us. And wanting us to be radically different to what we are would be kind of a misanthropic desire. It would be a way of wanting to change something that makes no sense. The changing which makes no sense. And here I really share a sense of humor that the teenage Beethoven developed, which is, look at us. Aren't we ludicrous? Aren't we humiliating? And aren't we amazing and worth loving? And the way my humor works when I laugh a lot in my private life, it tends to be more inclusive in that way, not us and them. My humor tends to be not, look at me, I'm amazing, and look at how dumb she is and he is. My humor is all about, oh my God, aren't we so ludicrously delusional and ludicrously victimized by this or that inability and incapacity? And isn't it also amazing to be in the world the way that we are? And so Beethoven was very, very, very mean, very eviscerating about people. And I am very eviscerating about people. Like I'm sitting here and you're asking me questions and my brain would still be, okay, what's the pathology of that person who's asked that question? But for me, that doesn't drive in the direction of wanting to distance myself, wanting to have an us and them dynamic where, I say, well, these people are amazing and I love them, and these people are stupid and useless and I hate them. So if I meet you in person, I am going to be very inclined to like you unless you're unbelievably annoying. But that won't come at the expense of visceral truth about everything, single thing that's wrong with you. And if I meet you in person, I'll probably know everything that's wrong with you within 5 minutes just by looking at you. But that for me is not associated with negative emotion. And so in that sense, I'm incredibly privileged because it also means that looking at the world as it is does not get me down. Most people are got down by looking at the world as it is. It's too much, it's overwhelming, but it has no negative effect on my health, on my mental health. So I'm very blessed like that. And so my relationship with humans is that, yes, we're limitlessly amazing. We're also limitlessly stupid. And I love us for everything, including our limitless stupidity. Um, so I am constitutively very, very lucky to be somebody who loves human beings in a way that is not dampened at all by sort of an evisceratingly clear picture of our faults. So it's a very kind of, if you like, I don't want to say this too strongly because, of course, there's all kinds of awful ways of being depressed in a way that you can't control. And in fact, most are that. But in a more everyday sense, it's a very undepressive personality that I have. And in fact, it's very difficult for me to have a depressive thought about the political world. It's very difficult for me to even have a thought about what it would mean to lose hope politically. It's ridiculous for me to lose hope. Not ridiculous for you to lose hope politically, but for me, it just makes no sense. The idea that I could lose hope politically next week. And so it's this love, warts and all, that is at the core of my personality and makes a lot of things easy for me as a result. And I know that's not how things work for others. Others are much more tormented by the dark side of human beings. I am not somebody who ignores the dark side of human beings. In many ways, I think it might be, as much at the core of us as the more constructive side. So I'm not somebody like my hero Isaiah Berlin, who faced darkness a bit, with his back to it, as Bernard Williams said about him. I tend to be very keen to face it forwards, as Nietzsche does, as Dostoevsky does. But it doesn't get me down at all. And so laughing at the absolute preposterousness of all of us, and the preposterousness of all of us in some respects, and the preposterousness of some, but not all of us in other respects, does not get me down. So I can say, look at us, we're a bunch of completely ludicrous, delusional, hypocritical chimps, and just our very existence is worth hysterical laughter, how ridiculous we are. But that goes with love for me. And this is why I mentioned Beethoven, because Beethoven, in a way that I could never match, was a great master of tender and loving mockery. It's one of the most extraordinary things about Beethoven's psychological states biographically, and some of his early writings, like the first two piano concertos. They express something like, well, no, I don't know why on earth I said that. Beethoven's greatest expression of loving mockery is the Debelli Variations, a late piece, the greatest piano piece ever written. And in it, Beethoven just eviscerates human beings. It's a piece based on humor. We are eviscerated in it, and yet we are also elevated and loved on a completely transportational scale. And so it's the two that go together for me that I think allows me to be a public intellectual who can keep improving. So that's really lucky. That I like human beings so much as they are is really, really, really lucky for me. Okay. I think we've done everything. What is the most preposterous thing about me? It's my deep love of wine, even though I am too ill to drink any. That is absolutely preposterous. That I think about wine for probably 5-10 minutes a day. Loving wine, of course, means you hate most wine. Appreciating something in life is usually a precondition for despising most manifestations of it. But it's pretty comical that I love wine so much. I adore talking about wine. I adore thinking about wine. I adore tasting wine. And I have drunk in 2026, cumulatively, probably between 1 and 1.5 glasses of wine. So if you didn't get that about me, if you didn't understand that quality about me, you would think I'm incredibly hateful of humans, incredibly mean, because I eviscerate people. But I'm actually shockingly loving of human beings. And if you asked me what's the thing that's most likely to make me cry, it's the improvement of a particular individual. It's a particular individual making progress. It's the thing that makes me cry the most. Vlad, I'd love to hear about your time in Tonga. I think there was also a question about how I got given a baby in Tonga. So, in Tonga, where I lived about 20 years ago, not for long, children are brought up by a family network that sometimes centers the parents, but not always. It's also true in Tonga that you can't complement anything because you tend to get given it. And there's a much weaker sense of private property. This has changed since then, it's become more Western. And so it's very difficult because if you see somebody who's made a beautiful basket, you can't really compliment it because they'll then be forced to give it to you, even though they've got no money and they've worked for it, on it for 2 weeks. So my closest friend, and in a past life, my partner, was running a little NGO there, and one of her staff got given a baby by somebody in church, I think after complimenting it. And then she didn't want it and gave it to me, to us. And we gave it back to her, and I think she kept it. So the baby didn't stay with its, I think the baby didn't stay with its parents, as far as I remember. A little bit about my time in Tonga. So my time in Tonga was basically a weird sort of health compromise because I just spent 2 years not being able to sort of talk and walk, but I was beginning to talk and walk. I was better, and I was sick but stable. So I could move to a relatively healthy country with virtually no disease like Tonga, that without a hospital system because I was much less unstable then than I'm now. And we felt that was a good compromise before hopefully I'd be able to come back to life. And I did, but I only came back to life sort of quarter time in about 2006, 7, after getting sick in 2003. Began a quarter time PhD around then. And it was magical to catch Tonga in that time slice before it got so exposed to the external world. It's incredibly beautiful. I lived on one of the Northern Island groups. I was in bed and in physical suffering most of the time, but I could also do quite a bit. I had 2 pigs in Tonga. Hillary was the main pig, and Ruby was a less main pig because Ruby was a boy. Ruby was brown and white, and Ruby ran away, unfortunately, and wasn't caught and got eaten by dogs, clearly. Hillary stayed with me. Hillary thought I was her mum. Hillary was a black pig with a white spot. And Hillary was absolutely devastated when I left. She hyperventilated. She got given to a very good person who lived virtually alone on an island. He was a chef, a German guy, one of the sort of 20 to 30 white folks on the island group. And we made a deal that he wouldn't eat her, which he didn't. And so Hillary went to live there, but she was very attached to me and was absolutely distraught about being given away. But obviously, imagine how ludicrous it would be to bring a pig to the UK from Tonga. And so now I'm a pig person. I have a pig called Rosie on Instagram, who I really love. She's only got 3,000 followers, but it's my favorite Instagram account. So I follow pigs on social media, and I'm a bigger fan of pigs than any other pet. Second would be cats for me, above all short hair cats. And dogs, I like dogs, but dogs are in that rating last for me. And I was very impressed by how intelligent Hillary was and how she could follow rules, but also know when there were exceptional circumstances and she could violate them. And I found that more intelligent than most dogs I'd encounter. And she also learned things by herself. She learned to open a double tap, so a tap that you have to move like that and then like that. She learned to open that by herself without training, so she could release the water in the rainwater tank and have a roll around in the mud. And also, Tonga was the last time in my life when my preformed young male brain distorted my sense of relationship with risk. Because before I got sick, I had a really stupid and infantile. This shows, right? Men are dumb, even when they're smart. But in Tonga was the last time I did something really, really stupid. And that was to nearly drown my family when they visited from the UK 20 years ago. And so I was on a better day with my health, and I could sit and drive a boat for like an hour. I was well enough to do that almost. And so we drove like 20 kilometers across the sea with one stop. And we stopped halfway, and the sky looked black right ahead. And I was thinking, yeah, we probably shouldn't go ahead. My dad very naively said, it's great, let's go. And my mother and my little sister also were kind of, well, maybe we should go. And the people on the island where we stopped off just said go. And the people where we were going to land said, absolutely don't go. We've got a much bigger boat and we would never send it out in these conditions. And so on we went, and we essentially reached a point where we were next to the last bit of land for like 1,000 kilometers. And we were in a patch of turbulent water, which would have capsized our boat if I had let go of the accelerator full pelt. And because I had a chronic illness, I lost feeling in my arm and I was on the verge of letting go. And if I'd let go, the boat would have capsized. It needed the acceleration to get through the waves. And it was a pretty open bit of water. And I think that if we repeated that, we would have probably capsized 1 in 3 times. And if you capsize there, either you hit one of the 2 nearby bits of land or you're gone. It's 1,000 kilometers of open ocean. And so that was an unbelievably stupid thing to do. That would, my brain, even as a 30-year-old, would be incapable of doing. But as a 24, 25-year-old, I did it. And that was the last stupid thing I did. And it sits alongside my getting stuck on top of a mountain in Switzerland, in Nietzsche's village in Sils Maria in the year 2000. Summer 2001, I got stuck on top of a mountain there. And I also managed to get involved in a car chase. It was chased by a gang in northern Cuba in 2001. Just due to profound immaturity and just not handling the situation very well. And so I've got all of these really humiliating incidents of completely inadequate relationship with risk. But they finally all stopped when I was about 24, 25, and I nearly drowned my family. At that point, since then, I've never done any. Well, I was sick, but even if I wasn't sick, I wouldn't have done anything highly irrational and risky. I'm going to stop raving on for a moment. Vlad, what do you think about the two-party system dying in the UK and the reform gaining traction? I voted Green, but I worry the left voters now to split between three parties. Well, the Green can't form a government. There's no chance they could form a government in the coming years. So we're on course, not inevitably, but probably for a reform government. So you're going to see a bit of a clusterification of Labour, Lib Dems, and Greens on the one side. On the other side, you're going to see the Conservatives with the slightly more extreme alt-right parties congregating. Um, our politics has Europeanized, but our first past the post system is still fixed to the idea of two main parties competing. So we're out of sync historically. Let's have a look. How do I see Zelenskyy as world leader? He's grown into his job. I've spoken about this quite a bit. I'm still probably going to do a main channel video about Zelenskyy at some point, especially as I'm coming back to the main channel more regularly these days. So Zelenskyy grew a lot and developed some amazing qualities during the war as a war leader. He is much less good as a national leader outside of the war context. Let's have a look. Yevhen is asking, I'm very interested in how people of genius think. What's the best source for that? There isn't one, as far as I'm aware, because the concept of genius has been too hijacked by the self-help manosphere. And it reduces most concepts it engages with to hacks. And it is both elitist and also fraudulently egalitarian, the way the manosphere deals with, how to hack your way to being amazing at something. So our culture is very bad at thinking about this. If you ask somebody like Isaiah Berlin what his definition of genius would be, it would be that somebody finds it easy to, in some sense, make the impossible possible. Something that feels impossible to most people is possible to that other person. And certainly works of art of genius are works of art that reconcile elements that normally one thinks of as being incompatible. So I tend to think of genius in three levels. I tend to think of low-level genius, somebody like the philosopher Bernard Williams. I tend to think of mid-level genius. If we stick with the philosophy example, that would be maybe somebody like Wittgenstein. And then there are world historical geniuses. And there you might put people like Plato or Shakespeare. What's the gap between a low-level genius like Bernard Williams and a very, 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 very good philosopher? So, for instance, my teacher at Oxford, Alan Ryan, who is a wonderful philosopher and has written wonderfully in the New York Review of Books, and his philosophy of the social sciences lecture course that I took was better than any book I've read on the topic. He said that he was always very conscious of how he was a couple of steps behind relative to Stuart Hampshire or Richard Wolheim or Bernard Williams, other philosophers who were a bit older than him, who I would categorize in this low-level genius compartment. And Alan Ryan's had a wonderful career. He's written wonderfully, but he always felt there was a sort of a gap. These people could do something that was just unavailable to him. And if you were to think for a very long time about the nature of that gap, you might actually end up concluding that, strictly speaking, that gap is not very big. But within that not very big gap, something happens that means that certain things for the people who move these extra 2 inches are possible. And the people who don't move these 2 inches, they're impossible. And so even though it's just only that little bit, it's almost as though, that extra 2 or 5% gets you into a completely different space of possibilities. It's almost like an inflection point. And as wonderful as a career Alan Ryan has had, he was always of the feeling that he couldn't quite do the magical stuff. He couldn't quite fly like these people could fly. So I'm often of the belief that the gap is often not that big if you think about it, but the not very big gap somehow allows for very different possibilities. Where to some people certain things are possible, and to others they're completely impossible. Can you develop this, or are you born with it? You can't develop it. So that gap between Alan Ryan and Bernard Williams, Alan Ryan could never have bridged by development. So when it comes to that gradation of talent, it's all born. But most people who are born with it lose it. They don't develop it properly. So absolutely development is essential. But if you are like Alan Ryan is, not on the level of Richard Wolheim or Bernard Williams as geniuses, but you are still easily in the top 1% of professional philosophers and then higher, there's nothing you can do to cross that barrier. You can just maximize the capabilities you've got, but it's just going to be uncrossable for you because you simply aren't talented enough. So there's also a lot of sort of brutality of fact about gradations of talent. Having said all this, the key theme with talent is still development, because almost everybody's talent is dramatically underdeveloped. So almost everybody can do a lot better than they are doing. And then, of course, there's something that bridges here, and that's if you have a talent for developing your talent. But if you have that then that's, well, it's too long to talk about it now, but I think that also can have certain ceilings and can allow you to, at the same time, bypass certain limitations that would affect you if you didn't. I'll talk about it more properly. I'm not making sense right now. Insert username. Having developed ME in your 20s, how do you cope with the grief of never had certain experiences when you were young? Anorexia stole many years of me, and the grief is making me bitter. I'm so sorry. For me, I don't grieve for what I've lost. I grieve for what I am likely not to have an opportunity to do before I die. So my grief is forward-facing, if you like. But that also means that there is a degree of openness. Like, I am open about what might or might not be possible in the future for me, even if the physical limitations remain fixed. I believe even fixed limitations allow you a certain degree of dancing with them. I mean, it is nearly miraculous, for example, what I'm able to do given my health limitations. So one thing that I think is completely gone for me is the feeling that there are certain things that I absolutely cannot do that I could do before. I used to miss that. Before I got ME, I couldn't publicly lose an argument. Now I easily could lose an argument, because my brain is much slower. It's much less good at covering everything on the spot. And I had that experience when I was doing my PhD. I did a presented, I think, a chapter of it. And this was 20 years ago, and I had incredible emotional pain about the fact that I was asked questions I couldn't answer on the spot. And I had to say to people, guys, I'm going to have to email you about this. I can't answer this. And that would have been impossible for me just 3 or 4 years earlier. And I couldn't. There's nothing somebody could say to me, even if they were the best philosopher in the world, for which I wouldn't have a response, and which I probably actually wouldn't predict that they would say even before they say it. That's not the case for me at all. And also how I speak is different. I spoke in paragraphs, and I never said or ah before I was sick. Now I say it all the time. And now I would never say there are 7 important considerations here and arrive at considerations 7 on minute 15, which is how I spoke when I was 21. Now I'll maximally say 2 or 3 things in one go, and even that is a real strain for me. So I feel no loss about that at all. It used to be painful, just not painful for me at all. What is painful for me, incredibly painful, is how difficult it seems to me to be, to do some professional work in philosophy while I'm restricted by my health the way I am. That is painful to me. But I don't experience that as, oh my God, look at what I could have done in the last 20 years. I feel that too. But more importantly, I feel that I'm on course to end my journey, biologically and professionally, without doing even 10% of what feels sort of constitutively essential for me to do. So that's some of the answer. Should you be optimistic about the future of Hungary now that Orban is out? Be hopeful. Don't be too optimistic. Optimism can be passivity inducing. Just be hopeful and proactive. John, thank you. Lando is talking about making a donation to me. Is that what you're talking about? I don't quite understand your message. Absolutely don't make any donations to me if they're a strain, if they're an economic strain for you. How does one have a transcendental relationship with nature? One exposes oneself, if one has the time and the money, to very different kinds of nature and sees what compels one over time and what speaks to one. It's quite a prosaic answer, but I think that's important. Jack, thank you. I believe you said that Russia has a weird relationship with the Enlightenment, Dr. Tavgai. Can you talk us through it? So, Russia is a Western country when it comes to its high arts and high culture. It's much less of a Western country when it comes to the rest of the culture. That's roughly the beginning of the answer. How do you find your relationship with eating meat, given your meaningful relationship with Hillary? Philosophically, how do you make an exception for the creature you know versus the creature you don't? So, for climate reasons, there are very good reasons to be not vegan, but mostly vegan for a lot of people. Joe Big Cat, thank you so much. For animal rights reasons and climate reasons, there's reason to be against the industrial mass slaughter of animals that we practice. If I were not, my diet trends in the paleo direction. If I were not sick, I would be much more vegan in my diet. So that, if you like, doesn't apply. Thanks, Rachel. That doesn't apply to sick people because diet is medicinal for them, really. Um, not that it fixes them, but because having a bad diet would make their health worse in a way that would be less the case for just an ordinary person. Now, there are plenty of climate and animal rights reasons to oppose our industrial mass slaughter of animals. I don't personally believe that there are reasons to absolutely stop eating animals. They're just very good reasons to treat animals a lot better and eat them a lot less. Mm, I basically, for 10, 15 years, have never really bought any animal product that doesn't come from a farm, which is probably both sort of biodynamic and where the animals wander and have a wonderful quality of life. Now, you might say, I can't afford that. For health reasons, I wouldn't eat. I just don't eat. I don't eat supermarket meat, basically. I've never really shopped in I haven't shopped in a supermarket really for many years. All my shopping is remote, of course, because I don't go out, but that's roughly that. I do accept one sort of vegan argument that eating an animal should remind you of its death. But whereas to a vegan, that's a discouragement, to me, it's potentially an encouragement. So if I'm eating an animal that's led a good quality life, wasn't part of the mass slaughter industry, um, my enjoyment of the meal will be connected with the death of the animal because the death of the animal is connected with the life of the animal. And so I don't evade the idea that there's a bit of murder going on my plate. In fact, it's part of the dignity of both enjoying the meal, making the meal good, and respecting the life of the creature that's on the plate. So I accept that vegan disposition, if you like. It just doesn't take me in a vegan direction. Um, I'm also on team human, as it were. I would always prioritize a human cause. I would respect other people for donating to animal causes. I would never personally donate to an animal cause under any circumstances, because if I'm sending £100 somewhere, I'm obviously going to send it to humans, not dogs. Um, mm, but I think that it is economically, climate-wise, politically, and ethically depraved the way we relate to animals and the way we mass slaughter animals. It doesn't follow from that, however, that there is any convincing argument that humans should not eat animals at all. Did teachers notice earlier on that you were an exceptional child? Well, later on in my school career, yes and no, because I was a terrible student until I went to university, and I was a good student at university because I could just do what I wanted. But when I was 16 and 17, the idea that you were going to make me read for a course something that I wouldn't want to freely read was absurd to me. So I had this slightly pathological, slightly egomaniacal resistance, which meant that I actually skived off all of my A-level exams. I simply didn't turn up. Well, they think I'm going to go to my A-level exams. Who do they think they are? I can't go to university at all if I don't sit them. Whatever. So I dropped down a year in school in my second year of A-level and repeated my A-levels. I was thrown off my music A-level, and I was thrown off my political philosophy A-level for not doing any work. The only reason I got a good score on my politics A level was because I read newspapers. I didn't touch a single textbook. I was the same at university. One of the first things I did at university was I took my textbooks and I put them in the bin. Um, but I could get away with that at university. I couldn't get away with that at school. So I failed school nearly to the point that I didn't get into any university. That's why I didn't go to Oxford or Cambridge after school. I was in a good state school, comprehensive school. But a small, tiny percentage of people could get into Oxford from there. I didn't. In fact, I got rejected by nearly all my universities because I didn't sit the exams. And then on the second repeat year, I still didn't sit all the exams, but I sat a couple. And that got me into my bottom choice university. That is quite a common. I mean, I'm not neurodiverse, so that makes it particularly weird because I didn't suffer from ADHD or dyslexia in a way that undermined my studies. Everything was easy for me. I just refused to do it. I'm going to read Isaiah Berlin and listen to Mozart. You're going to talk to me about the English legal system. I don't care. So there was this kind of bridging that happened at university where I only wrote about what I want. I want to talk about Marx. I can write about Marx. That's fine. But at school, I just refused to read anything that wasn't what I would anyway read if school didn't exist. And so that nearly meant I failed to get to university altogether. And I dropped down a year in school. So there we go. How would your life have turned out if you never got to the UK? Well, I lived in Israel before, so I would have stayed in Israel then. I would have had a real moral quandary now as an Israeli citizen after what they've done in Gaza. So I don't know. If I'd never left the Soviet Union, I don't know how to think about that. I would have. You never know. I could have avoided triggering my health condition. I probably would have triggered it anyway, but it needed two simultaneous infections and viruses to trigger my ME. So it's possible that if I'd just been in a different part of the world or been doing different things, I wouldn't have got sick. You never know. I would have been driven to philosophy. There is a chance I could have been a professional musician if I stayed in the Soviet Union. I could have been a conductor or something. I probably wouldn't have been a pianist because I wasn't exceptionally technically gifted. So I probably would have drifted to philosophy first and music second, wherever I was. How often do you use Russian in your daily life? So very, very rarely. Basically, I see my parents 2 or 3 times a year, and I speak with them a blend of English and Russian, leaning to Russian. With my sister, I speak exclusively English, and that's it. So I have not regularly spoken Russian as part of my daily life since childhood. And I don't feel at home at all in Russian. I feel like an alien in the language. Nobody's called me a rebel without a cause, but I'm very stubborn. In other words, if I think that something is right and a million people think it's wrong, and that's all there is in the world, me and that million people, unless I'm punished for it, it will be no psychological strain for me at all to have a different opinion to the other million. A question about Alexander Herzen. At least somewhere you mentioned that Alexander Herzen got me. Sorry, got you or got me? You mentioned once in some video that Herzen, which got me interested in his works. Okay, I get it. How important is he for Russia? He is Russia's most important 19th century social thinker. Isaiah Berlin was a great lover of Herzen. And as I playfully boast in my video about Russia's relationship with its own history on the main channel, I think it's the most viewed one on there. A few years after Isaiah Berlin died, his collection of Herzen bridged with mine because he had a few books missing from his sort of 32-book collection of Herzen's writings. And that collection was completed by my books filling it. In the hands of Henry Hardy, Isaiah Berlin's everything, his literary executive, his publisher, the man who made Isaiah Berlin famous. What role does Judaism play in your life? Zero. Literally zero. I am from Denmark and I have a Russian girlfriend. Is there anything I should be aware of that I might miss? A no often means a yes, and a yes often means a no for Russians. So as somebody who is Western psychologically, you might ask me, Vlad, talk to me about your recent health journey. And as a Western person, if you ask me that over breakfast, and it's something I love talking about, I like talking about, I'll tell you. And for me, there's going to be no difference whether you ask me in the morning or in the evening. For a lot of Russians, they can rebel against talking to you about it in the morning, but they'll happily talk about you in the evening. And so that's an example where a no means a yes. It doesn't mean that you can push them to talk about it in the morning, but it means the firmness of the rejection doesn't indicate a general lack of openness to talk about it, whereas in the West it would, and for me it would. So a Russian could tell you in the morning, I don't like talking about that stuff, don't want to talk about it, and they might love to talk about it by evening time. To me, that would be completely alien. To you, most of your Westerners would be completely alien. What wine is best for a birthday? Champagne, obviously. And the most wonderful champagne to try, because they do have some less expensive bottlings, is Aigli Ourier. So, but you'll still be spending $100. But if it's for a special occasion, it's worth it. Do not buy the trash stuff in the supermarket. A, it's going to be heat damaged. B, it's mass produced stuff that's not worth $40-50. It's not even worth 10 most of the time. So the sort of the commercially available champagne is one of the biggest gyps in the market. I'm wondering how often you read fiction, Vlad, having first watched your video with the Google translation. So reading fiction is at the core of my wherewithal in the world, but I get to do it 5% as much as I would like because of my health. This is really, really frustrating. How do you rate Chateauneuf-du-Pape? Chateauneuf-du-Pape has some great producers. the greatest producer, Rayas, you will not be able to taste because it's going to cost sort of 2 to 3 thousand a bottle. I would stay away from Chateauneuf du Pape in the entry level wine domain because it's going to be very, very high alcohol. What you're going to be able to afford is usually not going to be fresh enough. So it's not a category I would genuinely recommend if you want to spend $30 on a nice bottle of wine. But yeah, are there nice, great wines in the Southern Rhone? Yes, there are. But focus more on the Northern Rhone instead. Focus more on Cornas, Saint Joseph, less on Gros Hermitage. Hermitage is now very expensive and needs a lot of age. Did any treatment make you and me better? That you might feel confident recommending it to others? No, because treatment that makes one better is not going to make everyone better. There are maybe 5 to 10 drugs that help, and what they do is they take 20 or 30% of the population of the sick people and they make them a bit better. There's nothing that cures everybody. There is nothing even that cures a small minority. I was helped, of course, by the immune modulating drug that I took for a decade, and then tragically I became intolerant to it. And one of the biggest tragic elements of my health situation is that I'm intolerant to a lot of the medical interventions that might help me. That's one of the biggest dilemmas in my daily life that I'm balancing and dealing with. What do you think of Orwell? I haven't read Orwell's fiction since pretty much almost school time, so I'd need to reassess it. I probably don't have a particularly high view of it, but I do have a high view of Orwell as an essayist. So I do think also his intellectual simplicity and intellectual clarity and intellectual pristineness is connected with his autism. So I rate Orwell as one of the greatest essayists in the English language in the 20th century. So I would lean into Orwell's nonfiction. I would also, if you're thinking about essays, I would recommend you to read Clive James's essays. They are the best public intellectual essay type work from the last 20, 30 years. How would you describe Marine Le Pen psychologically? I can't. I'm not expert enough. I can tell you that I told you, I think I told people in one of the other lives that I do think she's impressive, and my partner, who's a journalist, who's met her, also thought that Marine Le Pen was one of the most impressive people she'd ever met, and she compared her to somebody else she was enormously impressed by, and that was Tony Blair. So that's quite a compliment. So I do think that Marine Le Pen is formidable. I'm going to withhold a character assessment. Maybe I can give you one in 6 months. I would need to study her a bit more. What's the better education system, the British one or the Russian one? I could only tell you about the Soviet one. The Soviet one would be superior for certain technical purposes. For getting people to think for themselves, the crappy British one would be much, much better. Any advice for better retaining what you're reading? Yes. Don't read shit you don't love. There's so much amazing stuff to read. Don't read crap. So the best way to retain what you read, unless you've got special circumstances like ADHD, is to love what you read and to have a relationship with the author. So if you're reading Aristotle, it's obvious how that would work. You're reading one of the greatest philosophers of all time. If you're reading, I don't know, Ezra Klein, engage with him. Like, what's it like for Ezra to be in the world? What is Ezra thinking about these days? How is his relationship with politics? What is he really trying to do in this paragraph? So that kind of open, loving engagement, which is not the same as agreement, is going to get you to retain what you've read much more. Jam Jam, no, I don't listen to rock and roll at all, and I observe it a bit as a cultural phenomena, but I have no engaged relationship with it at all. My favorite non-classical music personalities from the 20th century at the level of talent, so these are really pop musicians, would be number 1, Nina Simone, and number 2, maybe Edith Piaf. Rachel, you mentioned you're in disability spaces. Is it a community you have solidarity with? Yes. What role does socioeconomic status play? The socioeconomically most disadvantaged people are probably not even in that community because they aren't proactive enough to get online about their illness and limitations. So it's probably a little bit more middle class leaning just in virtue of being an organized online community. There's a lot of people I know through that community who had, go out of my way to support. So it means quite a bit to me, that community, even though it's a community of strangers. I got COVID when I was visiting the mum of a daughter who died from ME. So I want to do more on my Vlad's ME diary channel to talk to that community and help them make sense of things. I'm not sure I'm a very good advocate for that community, but I'm probably a bit better at talking at the community about the issues within the community, which is how to live with illness and uncertainty and suffering and so on, and how to think of your prospects, if you like, medically and politically into the future. Why do you call people by their first names? It's probably for the same reason as why I am very tactile with people. It's not narcissistic of me. Sometimes I call people by their first name because I actually speak to them. Sometimes I call them by their first name because they're just in the vicinity of people who all speak to each other. And then there's a group of people who have never met, in fact couldn't have met because we didn't cross each other chronologically, like Isaiah Berlin. I call Isaiah, and I call him Isaiah to people who knew and loved him for decades and went on holidays with him, and I'd never met him, and I speak to them and I call him Isaiah. Which is because I love him, in this case. And I also do the same with Richard Volheim and Bernard Williams. I mean, like, how weird would it be, given my way of relating to, say, Professor Williams. It's Bernard. I also think there's a ridiculous way of saying things in excessively a formal way. So I would have to say Professor Charles Taylor if I was introducing Charles Taylor at an event with a lot of people. But if I was engaging with him at that event and, let's say, interviewing him, I would call him by his first name. So there's quite a lot rolled into that, because all of these are different scenarios and they have something threaded through them, but they're also not all the same. I would not do that with historical figures. I would not say Ludwig, I would say Wittgenstein, because the historical distance is too much. But I think there is also, if there is anything pathological there, it could be this. It's that there are lots of people who I would definitely know personally who I don't, just because I'm ill. So maybe I'm inclined to call them prematurely by their first names, but I can know all of them. I just can't know all of them in the same kind of numbers as I would if I were well. So it's how I engage. I'm also quite hands-on. So I'm playfully bossy with people. I'm not rebellious at all about hierarchies. I never compete. I'm not competitive. I don't want to outperform anybody. But you're not going to impress me with hierarchies. Like, who are you? Well, I'm working in the cafe. Who are you? Well, I'm the Chichili professor of social and political theory at Oxford. Okay. But I'm not going to be dismissive of that. But I'm not going to elevate people into a kind of special role. And then also, if you're talking about personal elements of somebody, it makes more sense to call them by their first name, even if you've never met them. If you're talking about what's right or what's wrong in their thought in terms of the kind of person that they are, so on. But roughly, if you were to generalize, there are some special cases, like people I love very much who have never met. But I think that tendentiously it's a kind of extension of the way I engage. It's not disconnected from how I would hold somebody's hand and say, what's it like for you to be in the world? So the way that impacts an audience is that it's sort of okayish for most people and going to be grating sometimes for about 20% of people. What the most emotionally intelligent people in the community will see is that I'm not showing off. But the risk of doing it is that it will seem like I am showing off to some people. And that's, we have to be realistic about that. Is there anything Albert is asking about cognitivity itself that can make a move? That's actually an important philosophical question. There is a debate in philosophical literature between what's called internal and external reasons for action positions. And I am an internalist in that debate, roughly speaking. I believe that what motivates one is what motivates one. And I believe that and this is going to sound a bit scary, but I'll qualify it. But I believe that if you're not motivated to do something, at least at the level of the kind of philosophical terms I'd recommend, you don't actually have a reason to do it. But what I would then say is that you should do it. So having a reason to do something has to be a matter of a certain kind of positioning toward that act within your motivational set. If that positioning is absent, you don't have a reason to do that thing, even though it might be a really good idea and you probably should. Um, what you could say is that it would be good if that person gained the reason to do that thing. You're not competitive, but you say you have engaged in and won debates. Not really. I did debating, like in inter-school debating when I was a kid. Um, I genuinely dislike debates. I don't think they are conducive to good conversation. Do you follow ME research? Not as much as I should, um, but I'm vaguely aware of what's going on. But I am not, I don't have the medical or biological understanding to follow a lot of technical stuff. And yet there is some stuff I know that doctors don't, on the whole. So it's a weird situation. Vlad, where do you see yourself this time next year? Um, Nowhere. Is Oxford full of Einsteins? No, most people most students at Oxford and Cambridge are fairly, by the higher standards, are dull and unimaginative. So you wouldn't over romanticize that. They're mostly, I mean, one of the biggest conveyor belts from out of Oxford is PPE, politics, philosophy, economics. And a lot of these people end up in the city or in law. And a lot of them are a bit analytically clever, but often lost. So yeah, it's a slightly better quality of education than other universities, but you shouldn't over romanticize it either. How do you think, are there some fundamental limits on political agency for individual, or they're more historically determined? Your political agency is historically determined. In some political contexts, historical contexts, you're going to be able to do more. In other historical contexts, you're not. It's very important to have an objective understanding of how much is in your power, because it's only if you do that you're going to be able to get things more into your power, with some effort and endeavor. So somebody's saying, Chibarashka is saying, you're like my friend who does not see positions in hierarchy and will have a philosophical discussion with a barista at Costa. That's not what I said. Uh, um, I am not interested in discussing philosophy with anybody, basically. Even most professional philosophers. I'm only interested in discussing with about small handful of philosophers who are alive. Everything else is semi-interesting to me. And discussing philosophy with a non-philosophy professional is quite meaningless to me. It literally feels like talking to a 2-year-old. So I'm highly elitist. I'm not somebody who thinks that I'm going to have a good philosophical conversation with a Costa barista. What I'm thinking is that I'm probably not going to have a good philosophical conversation with the LSE professor. So it's not an equalization. It's rather that the LSE professorship doesn't guarantee that someone knows what they're talking about. It's not that there's this equality. It's very difficult, the truth is, for somebody who's not a little bit technically trained in philosophy to think well philosophically. It's quite a rare quality for non-philosophers to have good philosophical instinct. My late friend Greg had it. Clive James had it as a non-philosopher, but it's difficult. So if you've got a PhD in modern history or psychology, the chances are you really can't do philosophy. Like you can't. Um, so I'm not egalitarian about that, I'm afraid. I'm just saying that me holding a chair in philosophy doesn't guarantee that I know what I'm talking about. What the barista at Costa could have is a lot of philosophical talent, but the barista at Costa wouldn't be able to recognize whether they've made a good philosophical point unless they have some philosophical training, because they wouldn't even know what alternative points are available to be made. Do you see a rise in Marxist and classically left political movements? I see an increase in them as a result of the collapse of the liberal hyperidentity politics, because liberal hyperidentity politics co-opted a lot of leftists who thought it was a left-wing thing, which it wasn't. And as that dies out, there are going to be more people taking a classically left orientation and focusing on class. Do you like to do small talk? Yeah, I love to do small talk. I love to do small talk, but I also am disproportionate, almost to the point of weirdness, at asking big questions. So if you meet me, I am capable of asking you um, within 5 minutes something that's quite intimate and personal. Almost in a way that is socially weird, or could even look autistic, even though I'm not autistic. In today's economy, you might find a lot of people with high philosophical talent being baristas. So let me make this absolutely clear. For every sort of block of talent that might be embodied in a human being in the world, only a small percentage of that gets realized. So, who is the philosopher I admire the most in the world? Let's pick. Let's say I'd probably say Charles Taylor, who we just mentioned. Now, is there any philosopher who is better than him, alive and working? No. Are there people who have more philosophical talent than Charles Taylor who never became philosophers? Yes, probably 34 of them, right? I mean, Nietzsche went further. Nietzsche said that for every Raphael, there are 500 Raphaels born without hands, as it were. But it's very important to think in that direction, yeah, because you might be the best in your field in the world, hypothetically, but at the level of unrealized talent, there are going to be a couple of dozen people or more who never had the opportunity to develop the talent that they had. And the ratio is quite big. It's not 2 to 1. It's more like 20 to 1. So there's many, 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 many times more talent that never got the opportunity to develop in the world. So that's one good reason not to be so cocky, even if you are the best at whatever it is you do. Great question. On the power of ideas, Maxime is asking, um, can we have at the same time ideas and thinkers that are just a manifestation of the times, but also thinkers that are capable of changing the times? So this is literally a sentence borrowed from Charles Taylor's wonderful 1989 book, Sources of the Self. The causal arrow between reflection and practice goes in both directions. That's to say, you don't get Locke's conception of individualism arising in a vacuum. It can only arise in a certain cultural context in which it is already partly available. And then it is concentrated, systematized, spat out into the culture, and then transforms the culture. So it's practice causing reflection, causing practice. So it's very important that this is multidirectionally causal. There's no such thing as having an idea that then changes practice. The idea is only possible in a certain kind of milieu. Now, of course, a lot of ideas are radical and revolutionary and transformational, and Nietzsche, as a moral philosopher, is a great example of an exponent of such ideas. But even Nietzsche's ideas could only arise in a certain context that was up to a point ready for them. So it's both. And very often what happens is that ideas take something from the culture, systematize it and intensify it, spit it back out into the culture and change the culture that way. A lot of what philosophy is feeding back into the culture in a more systematic way, more of what the culture already is, or half is, or quarter is, but should be half, blah, 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 blah. Legit saying it's so good to hear your words. Thank you. Daphne, I lost a friend at 19. I don't know how old you are now, and I try to remember them. Is that healthy? Do you do that with your best friend? And I wish you and him a beautiful reunion in the cloud. Look, hope not too soon. Um, yes, I talk to my friend all the time. Right now, as I'm speaking to you, I can think of what he would say about this conversation that you and I are having. So I think of my friend certainly several times a week, even though he died 15 years ago. Most of the time when I think of him, it's to do with he and I hypothetically laughing at something that I encounter. When I find something funny that he or only he would find funny, I laugh at it as though I'm laughing at it together with him. Would you put yourself in that category given how your illness has made expressing your talent more difficult? Yeah, ultimately it's about the receipts. I don't have the receipts philosophically, so it's can I between age and 45 and death write one or two philosophy books? If I don't, it's essentially completely historically irrelevant what level of talent I had. That's life. Um, Now that doesn't mean that the talent wasn't there, even if it never got expressed in some philosophical work, but it's the receipts. So I'll be, if I'm lucky in that, if I try to do it, it'll be good. There's no question about that. But I don't know if I'll get a chance to do it, and I'll be judged on the receipts. If I don't have the receipts, I don't have the receipts. It's a zero. My contribution to philosophy is a zero. You don't contribute by being talented. You contribute by, acting out what your talent allows you to do. Vim is saying, where in life do I find the cafe to have good discussions? I don't know. Some of us are good. Some of us live in countries that are good cafe cultures. Others don't. But what I would say is that it's incredibly important not to be somebody too many of whose relationships are online, and too many of whose political discussions are online. That's not a great idea. Now, somebody could spin that and say, okay, but what if I talk a lot to myself about politics offline? Isn't that good? Yeah, that is good. But we've got to be careful about a situation where most of your engagement about politics and most of the friction you receive to your political views happens online. That's a worrying scenario because it disembodies you and it encourages you to disembody your interlocutors. I'm going to do a workshop about stuff like that when health allows, hopefully in a few months. Because I think there is certain stuff we just shouldn't do too much online, and then there is other stuff that we can just do better online. How does eating meat favor your management of ME? I would be worse if I didn't consume protein in that form. Are you good at math? No, I'm not. No, you shouldn't be afraid if you meet me in person or if you meet me for a consultation, because I elevate people. I don't bring people down, and I don't compete with people, and I also emotionally hold people. That allows me to be evisceratingly direct, but that is absolutely not everybody's cup of tea. And so, two things about my work and about me privately. My consulting is not therapeutic. So it's only for people who are able to have very direct conversations about their challenges and the mechanisms that are keeping challenges in place. It's absolutely nothing like therapy. It's for people who are well enough, if you like, to be able to deal with a non-therapeutic conversation. In personal life, I am extremely direct, and with my closest friends, I am very, very, very blunt, and they're blunt with me, and that's in the context of love, and we don't raise eyebrows about that. So with my closest friend, um, you know, she could make some really important speech, and I could say to her that it was terrible because there's like 4 things she should have done, and she did none of them. And I wouldn't sort of soften that or cushion it up. Um, so I have a level of directness in my close relationships that I think most people would not find to their taste. No, I hate chess. I hate chess. I am so bored by chess. I cannot. I literally barely know the rules. I just about know the rules. That's all. And I could not find. I would literally rather throw matches at the wall than play chess. I can understand what a marvelous activity it is. So this is purely a personal position about it. I have no interest in it. I'm so bored about it that I can't even listen to you telling me about how some amazing chess game went and how somebody did this opening gambit. My eyes just glaze over. I just can't take it in. Sorry. It's like you talking to me about a sport I'm not interested in. It's just hard for me. I am an extremist in that way. I'm either unbelievably interested in things or I'm not interested in them at all. And that creates a problem for me because a lot of humans need that in between time. Um, and I've got very little of it. But recently, I've had some funny, slightly embarrassing in between time. In the last month or two, I've had some hours where I was not so sick that I couldn't do anything, but I was sick enough so that I couldn't do anything productive. And that is how I know everything about the Titanic, unfortunately. I could start I'm almost on the point where I could start a Titanic YouTube channel. I'm not gonna do it. I'm not gonna do it. Thanks, Rachel. I'd love to run into you on the street. I'd love to be on the street. I'd love to walk down the street. I would love that so much. It feels something so magical and unreachable, and yet so essential and so normal. I wouldn't feel like this if I was just wheelchair bound in a sustainable way. But because standing for me is such a violent thing, it's not that I can't stand, it's that trying could be very dangerous for me. Um, it's this I have such a violent relationship physically with verticalization that just makes the idea of walking just so utterly magical. Even though I had it a year and a half ago, I walked into the damn hospital and I came out of the damn hospital not being able to walk. If I were healthy, would I take on Donald Trump in an MMA fight? Yes. Um, yes. So something like the MMA is very violent, but that would be more interesting to me than chess. So I I could talk about Conor McGregor's technique at his peak for an hour. I couldn't talk about I'd be an amateur and I wouldn't know what I'm talking about, but that would be more interesting to me than chess. Yeah, the hospital withdrew oxygen, withheld oxygen from me for 2 days, and that played a central role in how I potentially permanently lost the ability to stand, um, which is just so dumb and needless and disgraceful. Maxim, does the weight of Messi and Ronaldo? Um, oh, your comment disappeared. I don't know what you were asking. Um, I think that the presence of Messi and Ronaldo at their best made the game much better, and now we're in a bit of a lull. We have a low level of talent. I mean, who is the best player in the world? Maybe Lamine Yamal, maybe Kylian Mbappe, who is close. I mean, Dembele wouldn't get anywhere near winning the World Player of the Year 30 years ago. Um, what a wonderful player Michael Olise is on the right flank for Bayern Munich, but he's nowhere near being World Player of the Year in other eras. Um, in this era, somebody like Romario or Stoichkov would be just clearly the best player in the world. Romario right now would be the best player in the world, even though in his milieu he was never quite the best player in the world. He was one of 5 or 10. So we're living through a bit of a lull in football talent. Quite a bit of a lull. What's my hyper identity? My hyper identity is as a non-drinking wine philosopher. What would have happened if Navalny didn't die? He probably would have died later, unless he stayed out of Russia. Um, the Navalny group is only in a position now, without him much less so, to do something once things begin to rock and wobble in Russia. They're not able to cause things to rock and wobble in Russia. What advice for personal growth do you give to Trump? None. Trump cannot grow. It's impossible for him. There's no amount of therapy, even when young, I believe, that could have got him over the line. I don't think. Yeah. I think he can never grow. No, I've never tried painting. As I say, I was at some risk of going on the musical trajectory. Um, I would have been at that risk if I stayed in the Soviet Union. Um, so there was some risk of me ending up in the classical music world. But otherwise, there's no other way I could have got into any other art form. What do I think of Lightoller? Oh my god! So there were two very different situations. I'm not going to be long about this. There were two different situations on either side of the Titanic when she was sinking. And by the way, the entire cultural resonance of it, I think, is misrepresentative. In other words, many fewer people did anything wrong than is typically thought. The more you look at it, the less culpable all the key actors involved actually are. Number one. And number two, the more you look at it, the less culpable the ship actually is. So I am a lot. The rest is history, folks. Did a six series episode on the Titanic, and I am a lot more generous on the actors at the time than they were actually. But roughly, what was happening was that boats on one side were being loaded as men and as women and children, and then men if there are spaces to fill. And on the other side, Charles Lightoller was putting women and children in the boat and not filling up the empty spaces with men, even if men wanted to get on. So the captain's instruction, if you like, of men and children first was taken on one side of the boat as men and children first, and on the other side of the ship as um, sorry, women and children first, and women and children only on the other side. Um, Immediately, that does raise some questions about Lightoller, and also raises some questions about his neurodiversity, whether he was taking a command too literally. But I'm not going to get into it. But even with Lightoller, I think it's a more complex and a more understandable story. Even though, of course, yes, for goodness sake, you shouldn't have let out unfilled boats into the sea. The big ethical challenge that then came, and so I won't bore you with the details of what I really think about that. And then the real ethical challenge that came later is, should the folks in the non-fully filled boats have approached the space where the Titanic had just sank and tried to pick up people from that crowd of screaming humans in the dark, freezing sea? And the decision was that it'd be too dangerous to go there because the boats would get capsized. And so what happened was that a boat ended up going after most people had quietened down and died. There were very few people to rescue. I don't know. Maybe sometime on the Philosophy Channel, I'll talk about Lightoller's conduct and talk about the ethical dilemma of the lifeboats not rescuing people in the water. But as I say, tendentiously, I am a lot less harsh on almost all the actors involved. And I actually think that probably the ship saved a lot of people, rather than being somehow a poorly built ship that killed people. It's possible that other vessels could have been there in Titanic's place, would have done a lot less well than Titanic did, given what happened. It's so powerful. George Orwell said when he was a school child that the Titanic emotionally impacted him and his classmates more than the entirety of the First World War. So it has this extraordinary capacity to be evocative, partly because it's caught in between two worlds. One world feels very distant to us, and another world feels very close to us, and it's sort of in the middle. These are humans very different to us, but also like us. And the Morse code signals that the Titanic sent in the 2.5 hours of its 2 hours 40 of its sinking are as haunting as any video on YouTube. There's a transcription of it and a condensation of it into about an hour long. It's one of the most haunting things on the whole internet, in part because there is this palpable sense of extraordinary reserve about the imminent catastrophe that's engulfing one. And that's in part to do with the fact that these humans are almost like us in expecting that life gives them what they want, but they're not quite like us. They still have less of an expectation that life is going to give them what they want. So we would be individuating that tragedy more if we were 2026 humans than these 1912 humans did, but yet they also individuated it quite a lot. And that balance makes it an absolutely engrossing story. Zé Laurel saying, my Lebanese great aunt wrote about it with information that remains mostly unknown and undiscussed. It shows how non-white people were sociopathically selected for death. You were there were Lebanese people on the boat. There was all kinds of the second biggest language on the boat was Swedish. Being a child or a woman was more important than what class you were in, but what class you were in is hugely important. And first class people survived in far greater percentage than second and third class. So class was absolutely instrumental, but not as important as men versus women and children. How much would Nemtsov succeeding Yeltsin instead of Putin be able to alter the further trajectory of Russia? It would be much better, but there'd still be huge structural risk. The kind of structural risk for authoritarianism in Russia could not, it could, but it would not easily be alleviated by just one little swap of personnel. But yes, of course, Nemtsov would have been incomparably better than most, and certainly a lot better than the thing they've had in there for a quarter century. We shouldn't have got there at all. And Yeltsin thought that this thing shouldn't have got there. He realized his mistake very quickly. What are your platforms to raise more what are your thoughts about raising your awareness for me and using a platform for that? I am doing that. I could do it more. I'd like to do it more, but I'm doing it already. I get so much hate mail from people saying, I'm so disgusted by how you mention your health. What's that got to do with politics? So it does trigger people. All right. Last couple of questions. Use toothpick. You said we're very similar to our grandparents, great grandparents. Where'd you get that reference from? Significant cultural change usually takes 200 years, very roughly speaking. So you're essentially talking about the same culture if you go back 70 years. If you go back 270 years, you're not. If you go back 670 years, you're really, really not. They are substantially different from us even 70 years ago, but you're talking about gradations of difference. Why do you think the human personality will not develop if we live for 400 years? Because human psychology does not change in such a short evolutionary span. Human psychology 400 years from now, unless it is sort of scientifically amplified, um, won't be any different. There's no psychological there's a lot of cultural difference, which is difference in the way your psychology is expressed, but there is no substantive psychological difference between you and Aristotle, even though it's over 2000 years between you. It's very much the same human psychology, just radically different cultural circumstances. So if you're talking about actual psychological change for what the psychology of an individual is, that stuff doesn't change over 1,000 years. It just doesn't in any significant way. If it did, you would basically find it impossible to even make intelligible sense of ancient Greece. And ancient Greece is thoroughgoingly intelligible to us. Um, you mentioned Charles Taylor. What are some well-known philosophers you think are overrated? Well, I think that some of the post-structuralist and postmodernist philosophers are overrated. I do think that Foucault is a serious thinker. I think I think Derrida is overrated, and he is more of a philosophical entertainer than an important thinker for me. Um, I think it's a difficult question to answer because I think there are a lot of public figures who talk philosophy in public who are not philosophers. You might say their intellect could be overrated. But if you're talking about professional philosophers who sort of worked in a university most of their life, um, then I don't have too many sort of radical revaluations, in part because I don't think being wrong is the same as being less talented. John Rawls is wrong about what he's doing. His project is entirely misconceived, but he's still one of the most important political theorists of the 20th century. There's no conflict between being wrong and being important. Why am I not as passionate about the sinking of the Gustav? Rachel is asking. Well, because there's just no comparison. It's not even 1% as extraordinary as the Titanic, in my view, even though, of course, it would be if you talked about loss of life. But then we just end up saying that, you know, Hiroshima is more important than the Titanic, and that would be where you'd end up. I think there's something quite um, enthralling about the Titanic story. Um, so many different things come together to make it remarkable. So I'm very interested in other ship catastrophes and the greatest ship catastrophe of all time. But the Titanic for me stands out as somehow a concentration of many different kinds of things. Why do you think Keir Starmer is not resigning? Keir Starmer thinks he's doing the right thing. He wants to fight on. He wants to take the next necessary steps to make Britain better. I don't see how he can stay in power. He's going to have to go at some point. Didn't see Fukuyama's recent video. When will the Ukraine war stop? It's just beginning, in the sense that it's part of the disintegration of um, uh, Russia's imperial project, and we're at the end of the beginning of that, maybe. Um, so we're dealing with a long distance historical process. Um, so I'd think of it in terms of more than a decade to go. The war itself can stop, it can also restart, but the process it is a consequence of and really a part of is a longer run process that cannot stop in 2 years. Yeah, it's very difficult, content viewers saying, isn't it still egomaniacal, a bit of Starmer to stay on? It's very difficult for him to get that clarity of vision from inside, especially as he's so much somebody who needs to take the right next step. It's harder for him to see the bigger picture. So he genuinely believes he's being responsible. He's not saying, "Oh, I love power, I'm going to do it a bit more." That's what Nigel Farage would say. Starmer is not saying that at all. But um, it is not possible for him to be taken seriously as somebody who could win the next general election. And if that is the position, that your own members of parliament cannot take you seriously as somebody who can win the next general election, then your position is essentially in the short to medium term unsustainable. But he is very determined to go on. Do you find Zizek funny? Yes, sometimes. Tulip Motley, thank you. Do you like Russian music? I don't mean classical music. Uh, so I disproportionately do not rate Russian classical music. I don't think it's as good as Russian literature. So I have a lower view than most professional classical musicians of Tchaikovsky and Shostakovich, for example. Um, Other stuff, I mean, there is a lot of music that is Soviet pop music that is evocative of my childhood. And that's stuff that's stuck in my head. There is also all of this militaristic World War II related music that now, unfortunately, has got a very ugly feel about it since Putin's full scale invasion of Ukraine. Luke, thank you. I'm certain not going to sing you a Soviet pop song. All right, beautiful community. Let's begin to wind down. Do me a little favor. So Amalfitano is an amazing support for my YouTube project, my public intellectual project. And recently we've been in a dynamic where I'm not doing many of the things I'd love to do because I'm too sick. And she is living with a serious illness too, which has recently got really serious. And so she's not able to do much either. So she's a young person in her late 30s who's very gifted, and she's got really shockingly bad long COVID. And it's even amazing that she's managing to facilitate us here because she's dealing with so much physically. So send her good wishes to her health in the comments. Say Amalfitano, we're thinking of your health and we're sending you good wishes because she's having a really, really tough time. So, and as you do that, I'm also going to wish everybody who is in this community who is sick, you know, all the love in the world, and I'm feeling you. So send a hug to Amalfitano. Come on, a few more of you, do it. She's doing an amazing job. She's going to be 39 later this month, and she deserves so much more than what her life is at the moment. So we'll see. And if her health is better, my health is better, then we'll be able to do a little bit more. I'll be able to do a little bit more on YouTube. Well done, everybody. So, brilliant. Happy birthday to me. Happy birthday to all of you, my May birthdaying people. Lots of love, and talk very, very, very soon. One more announcement. I am genuine. I'm for reals about coming back to the main channel, being there once a week, or minimum every 2 weeks. So I'll be pushing you both on both channels to remember that. So we're no longer going to have this situation where we've got to have a video every 2 or 3 months on the main channel. We're going to be much more regular. Okay? So, well done. Well done, beautiful community. And I am going to crash, but tomorrow I'm going to edit a main channel video that I already recorded. So that should be with us hopefully in the coming days, and we're going to carry on with that rhythm. So keep having in your subconscious mind that the main channel is going to be more active. All right, lots of love. Bye bye.